Good morning, Senator, and welcome. As in the past,
Thank you.
it's really a pleasure and an honor to ask you some questions and listen to your answer. So, thank you very much for being here with us once again.
It was very good to be with you.
My first question for you is this. President Trump chose Robert O'Brien to replace John Bolton. Do you believe he will be another super hook who is even more of a warmonger? Or, in other words, is American foreign politics genetically unchangeable?
Well, Robert O'Brien is certainly connected with the deep state. He was close to Bolton. He's close to Mitt Romney, who's very hawkish. But I think that it's important not to underestimate John Bolton. John Bolton was a very aggressive bully. He was unscrupulous. He was dishonest. He was almost proud of lying to get us into wars. He was a very bloodthirsty man, and I think one of his principal objectives was to topple some country so that he could take credit for that, and that would be part of his future resume. So it would be a mistake to say that the two are somehow interchangeable. Robert O'Brien is not known for being such a forceful individual. Bolton used to almost shove the president into situations that were likely to trigger war. And I don't think that we'll see that with Robert O'Brien.
More than just rumors tell us of a will to start a war against Iran. Bolton, for example, made promises to the MEC, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq. In your opinion, why he was fired by President Trump? Maybe for an excess of promises?
I think that there were various things that came up. The way that he handled Venezuela, John Bolton's attempt to overthrow the president of Venezuela and install Guaido as a puppet government. It was farcical. It was like a Woody Allen movie. It was so amateurish. They had Guaido swear himself in as president, and when he did that, almost no people in Venezuela even had ever heard of him. They didn't know who he was, and here he's claiming to be the president. So that was a rather spectacular failure on the part of Bolton. I think that President Trump was not pleased by that. But if there was one thing that was Bolton's downfall, it was the fact that in 2020 we have elections. The president is up for re-election, the Senate, the House. And I think the president understands that if we take on a new major war with Iran, not just some little military demonstrations, but a major war, that he will lose his bid for re-election, will lose the Senate, will lose the House, the Republicans will be wiped out. Because the American people, they're war weary, they're tired, and you can only cry wolf so many times before people stop believing what you say. And it was clear that especially with those tanker incidents where you had attacks of some sort on tankers going through the Straits of Hormuz, it was clear that some of those were being staged. They were just pretext, and that and that Bolton very much wanted to drive the president into a war. Maybe a war that President Trump didn't want. But eventually, sometimes you can make things happen that that force the president to do things he doesn't want to do. That's what Bolton was trying to do. Secretary of State Pompeo was trying to do it, but not as aggressively as Bolton. So Bolton was extremely dangerous. Now, we have this situation coming up with Iran, Bolton has promised the MEK terrorists that they would be in Tehran running the government by today. And of course, he was wrong, but it's clear that he's more than willing to use terror as an instrument of American foreign policy. We've used it before. We used it against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and we had an army of over 250,000 jihadist terrorists under the direction of the Central Intelligence Agency in Afghanistan. Now we're trying to use the MEK terror group based out of Albania, where they have a very large, very well-developed infrastructure there. And the plan is to have them direct some sort of insurgency in Iran.
The conditions of the people affected by the so-called Arab Springs have generally deteriorated. Can we say that the project was completely wrong and that there is no more humanity in Washington?
Yes, it's interesting. I suspect that the Arab Spring was one of the more successful CIA operations. I can't prove that. It's only a guess. But one man lit himself on fire in Tunisia, and all of a sudden, within 6 weeks, the entire Middle East is aflame, and people are claiming that they are trying to bring about democracy and liberalization. And if you look at it, not one country has ever liberalized as a result of the Arab Spring. Every one, the groups that used the Arab Spring to bring about uprisings did it in order to bring about more dictatorship, more oppression of the people, more violence, more religious hatred. And so from the perspective of the world has suffered enormously from the so-called Arab Spring. The Arab Spring has caused enormous suffering, and it gave us the ability to go in and to cause all of these wars, to launch wars against Libya. Libya was one of the most prosperous and quickly developing countries in the world. We wiped it out. We utterly destroyed it. They've been without a government for 8 years. We went into Syria, which again, it was the most liberal of all of the Arab countries. It had the greatest women's rights. It had the greatest religious freedom of all of the Arab countries. And we went in and we have contributed to a mass slaughter of people in Syria. So one after the other. Of course, the Iraq War. Iraq was attacked without the slightest justification. Now, John Bolton, incidentally, was involved in perpetuating and creating the lies that went into justifying the war against Iraq. But no, we have not benefited, the world has not benefited millions have died as a result of the Arab Spring.
Why does the United States apparently fail to end the wars they begin?
You know, what happens is once we get in, there are tremendous economic forces at work. And so what happens is you have all of the arms industry, the makers of bombs, the guided missiles, the aircraft, all sorts of military munitions and arms. And they become advocates for continued war. Additionally, the deep state is a very real thing. It's not just some hypothetical construct. We have hundreds of think tanks that operate in the Washington, D.C. area, and they're all devoted to fostering, promoting war, and they're often funded by Middle Eastern dictatorships and companies that build munitions, warplanes, artillery, tanks, and so forth. And these people put out papers justifying wars, and those are published in the major newspapers all across the country. And then you have the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate International Relations Committee. Those are extraordinarily warlike, hawkish committees. Not every member is of that camp, but what's interesting is that they are very bipartisan. You don't have conflicts between the Republicans and the Democrats. They join together, and the leadership always advocates for war. And there is no group that's powerful that advocates for peace. So this is the reality, and I think eventually what's likely to bring peace is that we're going to bankrupt the country, because already a third of our national debt came about because of the Middle Eastern wars. And if you think of it, not one of those wars was necessary, not a single one. And here we are, we're now defending the most brutal dictatorship in the Arab world, which is Saudi Arabia. And suddenly, they've become our great friend, and so we use them to finance terror against the more free countries. I mean, for example, Iraq, by Western standards, was far from free. It was a dictatorship. But at the same time, Christians were able to practice their religion freely, just as they are in Syria. In Saudi Arabia, if you practice Christianity, you're beheaded. So here we find ourselves on the side of the most brutal dictatorship in the Middle East. And this is ironic because we're using our troops almost like mercenaries. We send them off to fight. The wars have no moral justification, and yet we send these gallant, courageous young men and women. We send them over again and again and again. We destroy their family lives. People don't care. They're like throwaways. But eventually, I think we're not going to be able to sustain this economically. If you compare the situation, if you look at what China's doing, China is moving quietly through cooperative agreements around the world with their Belt and Road Initiative. They're gaining an immense power and economic gains from what they're doing. On the other hand, we go in, we bomb countries, we destroy the infrastructure, and there's very little that's gained from it. Good example of what's happening. If you look at Iran today, there was an announcement made by the Chinese just within the last week or so that they are going to invest $400 billion in the Iranian oil infrastructure. Their oil fields and so forth. And you're talking about $500 billion that they're pumping into Iran. At the same time, India has made an agreement to develop the Chabahar port in Iran. So you see countries like China, like India, going in and making investments, and they will come out the winners, and we will come out the losers in this. In the end, I think all of these Middle Eastern wars are going to collapse of their own weight. I think people have grown very, very tired of 18 years of war.
There is a question about the Saudis. In fact, the Saudis have been fighting a proxy war against the Houthi of Yemen for years instead of the Americans. Yet, history teaches us that the people sooner or later comes when it is unable to fight its own wars. The question is this: what fate then for the American people?
Well, the war in Yemen is generally viewed as a continuous cycle of war crimes against the poor people of Yemen, the Houthi tribesmen, and so we're going over there almost like Saudi mercenaries, helping them. We're arming them. We're helping to target. Now we just sent some troops over to operate missile defenses because the Saudis are not capable of doing this. The drone attacks that wiped out half of their oil production for a few weeks. They had Patriot missile batteries all around there, and yet they were not able to stop a fairly primitive attack by drones. And the Houthi tribesmen in Yemen have become more and more sophisticated. Now, of course, the CIA and the State Department, Mr. Bolton, or Mr. Pompeo rather, they immediately claimed that it was Iran, and if it wasn't Iran, maybe it was Iraq, which is ironic because we control Iraq, the Americans do, and yet we're claiming, well, maybe these drones came from Iraq. I can't tell you for sure where they came from, but I can tell you that they would not be fired if the Saudi Arabians were not invading Yemen. The Saudis are like a schoolyard bully who goes up and a little girl punches him in the nose and gives him a bloody nose, and he runs and cries to the teacher and says, "Oh, this little girl, she just punched me in the nose." The Saudis are so inept at what they do. They invaded Yemen in order to install a puppet government. There's a fellow, this Hadi, who doesn't even live in Yemen, but they want to put him in. So the United States is helping Saudi Arabia install a puppet government that the people of Yemen do not want. They would hang him if he went back. So instead of worrying about where these drones came from, we ought to worry about how to stop them. And the way to stop them is for Saudi Arabia to bring its forces back out of the borders of Yemen returned to Saudi Arabia, and the whole thing would end. So this is where we stand, and it is true. The Saudis cannot fight their own wars, and they shouldn't be making wars. They're making wars for us to have to fight. The other day, Secretary Pompeo said the drone attacks are an act of war. Well, the follow-on question is, if they're an act of war, war against whom? Whose war? Why is that an act of war against the United States? They didn't shoot drones at us. They didn't shoot drones at our troops. Why is it an act of war when they're fighting back and forth with the Saudis, and the Saudis bomb them and they shoot drones at the Saudis? Why should that be an act of war for the United States or for anyone other than Saudi Arabia?
Well, Senator, this was the last question, and I thank you very much for your time and your kindness. I hope to see you again in the future.
Okay. Well, good luck with everything that you're doing. I appreciate it. You know, it's ironic that we have to get the truth from other countries, and we can't get it from our own country. But that's where we stand right now, and so I appreciate everything that you're doing, because you're getting out a lot of good information.
Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Okay, goodbye now.